Request the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Yesterday afternoon, the White House issued a statement of administration policy which said that when the legislation Speaker Boehner is now revising reaches the President's desk, unnamed senior advisors will recommend that the President veto it. Now, I have a question for those senior advisors. What about this legislation is so offensive that you'd rather see the nation default on its obligations than have the President sign it into law? From what I can tell, the only thing in this bill the President hadn't already expressed his support for, either publicly or privately, is that it doesn't get him through his election without having to engage in another national discussion about the debt crisis that's brought us to this point. So I would ask these senior advisors whether that's a position they want to put the President in. Do they really intend to suggest that he veto the nation into default for political reasons? That's how I read the threat, and I think that's how the rest of the country would read it as well. So this morning, I'd like to reiterate my very strong support for Speaker Boehner, the House Republican leadership, and this plan to prevent default and reduce Washington spending. I also want to commend the Speaker for his efforts and for his determination. This hasn't been an easy process, but I hope through it all the nation sees how hard the Speaker has worked to ensure our nation avoids calamity while safeguarding the American dream. The nation's had a chance to see the Speaker at his best over the past few days. Unlike the President, he not only put forward actual legislation to prevent this crisis, he's keeping his promise to cut spending more than any increase in the debt limit with no tax hikes. And what about the President's plan? Well, when asked the President's plan, his aides point to a speech and a veto threat. Madam President, with all due respect, Congress can't vote on a speech, and a veto threat won't prevent default. The fact is, Republicans have offered the only proposal at this point that attempts to get at the root of the problem and which actually has a chance of getting to the President's desk. That's why we'll continue to press for the legislation Speaker Boehner has proposed. And that's why we'll fight against anything that pretends to solve the problem but really doesn't, including the bill from Senate Democrats that proposes the largest debt limit increase in history while falling $500 billion short on the cuts it claims to provide. Now, Madam President, this crisis our nation faces at this moment has a very simple cause, easily understood. Washington spends a lot more money every year than it takes in. Do that every year, and the debt piles up. And now we've reached the point where our deficits and debts are so large they're suffocating job growth, threatening the wider economy, and imperiling entitlements. It took more than 2 centuries for Washington to amass a debt of $10.6 trillion. But just 2.5 years after President Obama swore the oath of office, it's higher than that by more than a third. And based on the President's actual policies, the situation is expected to get much worse. In just 5 years' time, under President Obama's budget plan, the federal government will spend almost as much money just to cover the interest on its debts as it will on national defense. And over the next 10 years, the President's policies will add more than $9 trillion to the debt. This is why S&P revised its long-term credit outlook for the U.S., not because we haven't authorized the President to spend more money, but because he's asking for too much of it. And yet, incredibly, the President's budgets would do nothing to reverse this trend. So he can claim to be interested in a solution, but what he's actually put on paper makes the problem worse. Right now, the President is asking Congress to raise the debt ceiling by more than it's ever been raised before in our history, even as the nation is teetering on the edge of a crisis caused by that very debt. Let me repeat, our nation is facing a crisis because of the size of our debt. And the President of the United States, the man that Americans elect to be the steward of our economy, is threatening to veto any bill that doesn't add more than $2 trillion to the debt ceiling, the largest increase in history. The President's not taking a stand on cuts. He's not taking a stand on reform to entitlements. He's not insisting on reforms. Forget all of that. What he wants more than anything else is more room under the debt ceiling to get him through the election. He said that is his bottom line. So I remain as committed as ever to resolving this crisis in a way that will allow us to avoid default without raising taxes and to cut spending without budget gimmicks. There's only one option that does that, and that's the one Speaker Boehner has proposed and that is being improved as we speak. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Order.